Picture this scene. The body of a condemned man, stripped of all honor in the eyes of society, pierced by iron nails, wounded, covered in blood, abandoned even by those closest to him, now being tenderly prepared and covered with precious oils, the kind reserved only for royalty. Who would have the courage to do something like this? It wasn't the closest followers, nor those who had promised undying loyalty. It was a Pharisee, a distinguished member of the Jewish council, a man who, until that moment, was terrified at the mere thought of being linked to the man from Nazareth. That man was Nicodemus. He had approached Jesus under cover of darkness, hiding in the night, afraid of what others might think. During that secret meeting, he learned about spiritual rebirth, about the breath of the Spirit, about divine love that rescues rather than punishes. But Nicodemus stayed torn between his heritage and his belief, between shadow and brightness, until the very instant when everyone else ran away, when the teacher was shamed and left to perish. Nicodemus finally took his stand. He came forward, he embraced the broken body of Jesus, and he honored him not as a criminal, but as royalty. What pushed this man to put his standing, his career, and even his very existence on the line for someone who had been executed? How did a person who once dwelt in the fog of hesitation become the follower who celebrated the Son of God before everyone? And what does his delayed choice reveal about trust, bravery, and giving oneself completely? Today, you will discover the untold story of Nicodemus, the man who tended to the body of the crucified Jesus. Stay until the very end and learn why this overlooked account has the power to permanently transform how you view the greatest sacrifice ever made. Come with us as we explore the journey of a man who moved from darkness into brightness, Nicodemus, the instructor of Israel, who approached Jesus privately and received answers that would reshape his entire existence. Get ready to witness how a single meeting can transform not just one person, but all of eternity. That evening, beneath the heavy silence that covered Jerusalem, one of the most powerful men in the Jewish council gambled everything to meet the one who could either ruin his standing or unlock the gates to eternal life. The name Nicodemus carried weight and influence. It represented knowledge, honor, and religious commitment. For the people of Jerusalem, he wasn't merely another religious scholar. He was an important Pharisee, a spiritual lawmaker, a protector of sacred customs. He belonged to the exclusive circle of 70 men who formed the Sanhedrin, the highest court that ruled on Israel's most significant matters. His words held both political and spiritual influence. One statement from him could shape someone's destiny, alter how laws were understood, or decide the outcome of major trials. Nicodemus was born in Jerusalem to a family with deep roots in Pharisaic tradition. His father, also a well-regarded teacher, had been a strict and careful judge. He was a man of firm principles whose good name had lasted for decades as a symbol of honesty and passion for the Torah. His mother, equally devoted, descended from a family line that carefully guarded Jewish customs, handing them down through each generation. From his earliest years, Nicodemus was shaped in this atmosphere of dedication and strict adherence to religious law. His education started young. As a child, he could already speak long passages of scripture from memory, not just in Hebrew, but with the exact pronunciation his instructors required. Through the years, he learned from the finest rabbis, committing to memory, analyzing and practicing the law in every aspect. When he reached adulthood, he earned his seat in the Sanhedrin, not simply through family connections, but through the acknowledgement of his talents. People saw him as a thoughtful, measured man, someone who weighed his choices carefully before reaching any conclusion. Jerusalem, the city of his birth, his home, and his authority, was the living pulse of Israel. Its winding streets and massive walls protected not only the heritage of the nation, but also the symbolic dwelling of the Almighty. The temple rose at the center like a spiritual lighthouse visible from great distances, and it was there that travelers came from everywhere, carrying their gifts and offerings. Nicodemus knew every section of that holy complex, from the outer courtyards to the priest's area, and understood that his duty was to protect the sacredness of that place. But despite this spotless existence, Nicodemus carried a growing unease. In recent months, he had been hearing about a man from the Galilee region named Jesus of Nazareth. News about him had traveled rapidly beyond the city boundaries. Those who were blind could suddenly see, the crippled could walk. Those with skin diseases were made whole, and multitudes gathered to listen to his teachings. But it wasn't only the miraculous acts that left an impression, it was the power with which he spoke, as though the very voice of the Almighty flowed through his lips. Nicodemus listened to accounts that stirred something within him. Ordinary people, fishermen, outcast women, tax gatherers, all declared they had been completely changed by this man. However, inside the Sanhedrin, responses were mixed. Many leaders viewed Jesus as dangerous, a troublemaker who might upset the established system and weaken the power of religious authorities. Amid conversations and hidden accusations, some were already scheming ways to quiet him. For someone of Nicodemus's standing, getting close to Jesus meant risking everything he had. He fully understood the dangers. He would be labeled a betrayer, someone who had softened the opposition against the Nazarene. And yet, something inside him burned with the desire to learn more, to hear with his own ears, to look directly at the one many addressed as teacher. That evening, as the city rested under the pale glow of moonlight, Nicodemus chose to move forward. He wrapped himself in a dark cloak, pulling it over his head to avoid being recognized, and slipped out of his home without a sound. Every footstep was deliberate. He stayed away from the busy roads and took narrow, shadowy paths, like a man who knows his presence must remain hidden. The evening air was cool, and a soft breeze carried the smell of fresh bread from some faraway bakery. In the distance, the steady footsteps of guards on patrol could be heard. Jerusalem was asleep, but Nicodemus's heart was wide awake, racing with the nervousness of a man about to step across an unseen threshold. When he finally arrived at the spot where he expected to find Jesus, he saw him resting beneath an olive tree. There were no crowds, no soldiers, no followers nearby, just him alone, peaceful as though expecting someone. Nicodemus felt a tremor run through his body. He moved closer slowly until his gaze met that of Jesus. In a quiet voice filled with honesty, he said, "Teacher, we understand that you are an instructor sent from God. For no one could perform these wonders you do unless God were with him." By saying "we understand" rather than "I understand," Nicodemus was suggesting he wasn't the only one who felt this way. There were other leaders, possibly even within the council itself, who acknowledged this man's heavenly origins. But his words also exposed something else. A crack was starting to form in the fortress of religious certainty that had surrounded him throughout his life. He didn't realize it yet, but he was about to hear something that wouldn't simply answer his questions. It would tear down and reconstruct his entire understanding of God, existence, and the heavenly kingdom. But what Jesus said that evening would alter his life permanently. The evening was peaceful, and the quiet that wrapped around the garden seemed to hold something holy. Moonlight passed through the olive leaves, creating gentle shadows on the ground below. Nicodemus still felt the heaviness of his own words hanging. In the atmosphere, there was the admission that Jesus came from God, but what came next shattered the very foundation of everything he believed. Jesus, with a serene expression and a steady voice, replied directly, "I tell you the truth, unless someone is born from above, he cannot perceive the kingdom of God. For an instant, Nicodemus blinked, nearly unable to grasp it. Born from above. The phrase seemed foreign, unthinkable. He was a scholar of religious law, deeply familiar with his mind raced through ancient writings, prophetic words, and scholarly explanations, searching for any reference to these words. But nothing matched. "How is it possible for a man to be born when he has grown old?" he asked, feeling like a pupil confronted with a puzzle that demolished all familiar reasoning. Can he somehow go back into his mother's body and come forth again? Jesus held his gaze steady. There was a stillness about him that didn't come from the practice of instruction, but from someone who spoke with complete command over his subject. "I tell you with certainty, unless someone is born through water and the Spirit, he cannot step into the kingdom of God. Whatever comes from human nature remains human, and whatever comes from the Spirit is spiritual. Don't be astonished that I told you, you must experience this rebirth." The words lingered in the atmosphere, sinking deep, as though reaching not only for Nicodemus's intellect, but for his soul. He was thoroughly acquainted with cleansing rituals involving water, the ceremonial washings, the regulations for appearing pure before the Almighty. But Jesus described something beyond the observable, an inner transformation that didn't rely on temples, offerings, or ritual sacrifices. Nicodemus sensed something breaking open inside him. His entire life, he had trusted that loyalty to the law and careful observance of the commandments were the path to pleasing God. But Jesus was revealing a truth that couldn't be reached through human striving, but through a mysterious work of God's own Spirit. "How is this even possible?" he asked, his voice no longer carrying its original confidence. He no longer spoke as a magistrate or an instructor, but as a vulnerable man facing a mystery beyond his comprehension. Jesus then offered a simple comparison, but one that carried the significance of an eternal truth. The wind moves wherever it chooses, and you can hear it passing, but you cannot tell where it originates or where it travels. This is how it works with everyone born of the Spirit. Nicodemus remained silent. He could sense the gentle breeze moving through the branches at that very moment, brushing against his face. The wind was invisible to the eye, but its effects were undeniable. It rustled the foliage, refreshed the atmosphere, altered the surroundings. This, Jesus explained, was how the Spirit worked in a person's existence. Unseen by human sight, but genuine and life-changing, for a Pharisee trained to evaluate spirituality by observable deeds. This was deeply unsettling. Nicodemus felt as though a barrier constructed over many years was starting to fall apart. If entering the kingdom of God depended on this spiritual rebirth that couldn't be produced through ceremonies, then the entire framework he had known required reconsideration. His thoughts were engaged in conflict. On one side, everything in his upbringing insisted that righteousness emerged from exact compliance with the law. On the other, the words of Jesus disclosed that genuine entrance into the kingdom was connected to something that couldn't be purchased, achieved, or merited, only accepted. The quiet between them wasn't hollow. It was filled with spiritual gravity. Nicodemus felt as though he stood at the edge of a vast drop, gazing into a reality he had never imagined. And the longer he looked, the more he understood he couldn't cross carrying the weight he bore, customs, positions, convictions. There was an unspoken invitation in what Jesus said. It wasn't merely a request to comprehend. It was a summons to let go completely. But letting go meant acknowledging that all his status and learning weren't sufficient to enter the kingdom of God. This demanded humility, and humility required shattering the pride he hadn't even realized he carried. As the evening breeze kept blowing, Nicodemus sensed his heart pulled between intellect and trust, between what he had mastered and what was being unveiled. He stood before a decision he didn't yet fully grasp, but which he recognized as pivotal. But how does one place trust in something that contradicts all reasoning? Nicodemus was still absorbing the words about spiritual rebirth when Jesus tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with him in a way that seemed to pierce not just his thoughts, but his deepest hidden intentions. The evening breeze still moved, carrying the distant fragrance of soil and olive groves, but now the space between them felt charged with an unspoken intensity. "You are an instructor of Israel, and still you fail to grasp these matters," Jesus asked without mockery, but with a directness that made Nicodemus sense the gravity of every word. That statement landed hard. Nicodemus had always been celebrated as a source of wisdom and scriptural expertise. From his youth, he had sat learning from the most honored rabbis, committed every scriptural detail to memory, engaged in debates with celebrated teachers, and through the years rose to become an intellectual authority in the council. When challenging questions emerged, he was the one people sought. He was the one who clarified, decoded, and illuminated difficult passages. But now, standing before this Galilean, he felt like a young student just learning his letters. The question Jesus posed didn't come across as criticism, but as a reflection, a painful image that revealed an undeniable truth. Despite all his expertise, he had missed the core meaning of the kingdom of God. Jesus went on, his voice steady but unwavering. "I tell you with absolute certainty, we speak about what we understand, and we give witness to what we have observed, yet you refuse to receive our testimony. If I have described earthly realities, and you struggle to accept them, how will you accept when I describe heavenly realities?" Every word cut deeper. Nicodemus was familiar with precise definitions, with regulations that could be broken down and put into practice. But now he encountered truths that couldn't be weighed by reasoning or legal debate. The kingdom Jesus portrayed was not something achieved through accomplishment, but accepted through undeserved favor, and this disrupted the entire mental structure of a Pharisee. He searched for responses, but his thinking was split. One part wanted to rely on rational analysis, to hunt for links with ancient writings that would validate these statements. Another part was starting to recognize that perhaps he was encountering something that could never be completely understood through intellect alone. The quiet that followed was heavy. Nicodemus stared at the dusty ground, briefly avoiding the gaze of Jesus. The words, "You are the instructor of Israel, and you fail to grasp," repeated in his mind like a summons to humility. It was as though the Almighty himself was declaring, "You have memorized the words, but you haven't discovered the complete meaning yet." He understood that studying about God and actually knowing God were entirely different things. For years, his spiritual life had rested on discipline, scholarship, ceremonies, and careful adherence to religious law. But now Jesus was showing him that the entrance to the kingdom wasn't unlocked by religious credentials, but by a spiritual rebirth that only the Spirit could produce. This truth was painful because it dismantled the very base on which he had constructed his sense of self. Being instructor of Israel was more than a designation, it defined his entire existence. And yet, standing before Jesus, this designation seemed insignificant, nearly meaningless. The evening felt more hushed now, as though the world surrounding him had paused to witness this exchange. Nicodemus felt laid bare, but not in a shameful way. It was a necessary exposure, like the work of a physician who must open an injury to bring healing. Jesus wasn't merely instructing, he was extending an invitation. Every statement was an outstretched hand, urging Nicodemus to abandon the safety of familiar ground and venture into the unfamiliar, a venture of trust. Within himself, Nicodemus wrestled. There was self-importance, There was anxiety, and there was also a sincere longing to comprehend. He recognized that accepting this reality would force him to reconsider his whole existence. It could create division between him and his colleagues, his heritage, and even his own household. But what if it were accurate? What if Jesus truly originated from God, not merely as an instructor, but as the actual fulfillment of ancient prophecies? Nicodemus's intellect tried to push back, but something in his soul was starting to soften. He was learning that regardless of how many designations and how much expertise he held, he remained a man who still needed instruction from the Son of God himself. What occurs when the instructor discovers he still has lessons to learn? Before we proceed, we ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us keep sharing meaningful messages like that of Nicodemus, a man who started his path in secrecy, but concluded by proclaiming his conviction before all. Now let's advance to the critical moments, the council, the cross, and the ultimate bravery. The gaze of Jesus never shifted. There was a steadiness in him that didn't frighten, but rather drew people in. Nicodemus, still sensing the heaviness of his recent words, waited for what would follow. Until that point, Jesus had spoken of unseen matters, spiritual rebirth, the movement of the Spirit, realities beyond the physical. But now his manner seemed to shift, as though preparing to unveil the center of his message. No one has gone up into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man who exists in heaven, Jesus declared, and his words, though straightforward, carried an authority that Nicodemus couldn't dismiss. The Pharisee's brow furrowed. The Son of Man was a title rich with significance in Scripture used by the prophets, particularly Daniel, to describe a celestial figure who would receive everlasting dominion. Nicodemus was familiar with the passage, but now standing before him was an apparently common man declaring he had descended from heaven. The trained intellect of Nicodemus fought to connect the two, the prophecy he had studied and the breathing reality standing before him. Jesus went on, and the evening seemed to thicken, as though the very stars were bending closer to hear. And just as Moses raised the serpent in the desert, in the same manner the Son of Man must be raised up, so that everyone who places trust in him will not be destroyed, but will possess eternal life. The picture was vivid in the mind of Nicodemus. He was familiar with that passage from Numbers. The Israelites, complaining and rebelling against God, were attacked by deadly serpents in the wilderness. Many perished until Moses, directed by God, crafted a bronze serpent and mounted it on a pole. Anyone who had been bitten simply needed to gaze at the elevated serpent to find healing, a straightforward act of trust. Gaze and survive. Now Jesus was declaring that he himself would be raised in the same fashion. He didn't reveal all the specifics yet, but Nicodemus grasped the connection. Just as the people in the wilderness gazed at something raised high and were rescued from physical death, so too there would come a time when, to escape spiritual death, they would need to gaze upon the Son of Man. And then came the statement that would reshape everything Nicodemus had understood. For God had such deep love for the world that he offered his one and only Son, so that everyone who places trust in him would not be destroyed, but would possess life without end. For God did not dispatch his Son into the world to bring judgment upon the world, but so the world through him might find rescue. Nicodemus could barely draw breath. This was unlike any teaching he had ever encountered. He was accustomed to hearing that God cherished Israel, his selected nation. But Jesus spoke of the entire world without exception, and he spoke of a love so profound that it moved God to surrender what was most treasured to him, his own Son. What struck him was the contrast. He, a Pharisee, had devoted his existence to teaching that following the law was the path to avoiding destruction, But Jesus declared that the path was trust. It wasn't about earning, but about relying. It wasn't about performing ceremonies, but about yielding to a love that descended from heaven and reached the earth. The words, "not to bring judgment, but to bring rescue," echoed powerfully. Nicodemus understood that the picture of God many held was that of a harsh magistrate, prepared to inflict punishment. But Jesus revealed a God whose deepest desire was to deliver, to restore, to revive. As Jesus spoke, Nicodemus started to comprehend that he was standing before the very heart of what he called the kingdom of God. It was not a kingdom established by weapons, political maneuvering, or rigid adherence to regulations. It was a kingdom launched by self-giving love, maintained by unmerited favor, accessible to all who would place their trust. The Pharisee sensed the magnitude of this disclosure. On one hand, it brought freedom. If deliverance rested on trust rather than achievements, then even the greatest wrongdoer could enter the kingdom. On the other, it presented a challenge. If this were accurate, the entire religious framework he understood would require re-examination. He gazed at Jesus, attempting to envision what it would mean for the Son of Man to be raised up. He didn't comprehend every detail, but the expression on Jesus indicated that this moment was already appointed, like a pressing assignment. In his depths, Nicodemus recognized he was hearing something that would never fade from memory. These words would resonate within him long after that evening ended, provoking him, disturbing him, calling him toward a decision. But hearing is not identical to yielding in trust. Darkness settled like a dense covering over Jerusalem. But in the modest garden where the two men conversed, something radiant seemed to expand with each sentence. Nicodemus, motionless, was no longer the same person who had arrived there concealed. His breathing had grown shallow, and his eyes, once assured, now fluctuated between awe and apprehension. Jesus spoke, and every word not only clarified, it pierced and restored simultaneously. "Whoever places trust in the Son faces no judgment," he declared, with the calmness of one who states what is everlasting. "But whoever refuses to trust stands judged already, because he has not placed trust in the name of the one and only Son of God." The declaration hung suspended, weighty and unmistakable. Judgment not as an arbitrary ruling, but as the result of a rejection. Nicodemus sensed the significance of the word trust. It wasn't merely agreeing with concepts. It was yielding, relocating the foundation of confidence from one's own merit to the person of the Son. A Pharisee might spend his whole existence reciting truths and still exist without genuine trust. That realization burned like an ember. Jesus continued, and the explanation grew more penetrating. "And this constitutes the judgment. The illumination entered the world, and humanity preferred shadow over illumination because their actions were wicked. For all who practice wickedness despise the illumination and stay away from the illumination, so their actions won't be uncovered. But whoever practices what is genuine approaches the illumination, so it becomes evident that their actions have been accomplished through God." Illumination and shadow. Words so uncomplicated, yet so complete. Nicodemus recognized the imagery. Illumination had always represented God's presence and direction, shadow for ignorance, wrongdoing and separation. But now the illumination had a face, a voice, an identity. The illumination stood directly before him. He swallowed with difficulty. The resonance of those words discovered within him corridors he hadn't even known were there. Humanity preferred shadow over illumination. The phrase flashed through his recollection, triggering uncomfortable pictures. He saw himself as a younger man, crafting flawless legal opinions while turning away from human distress that didn't align with the council's rulings. He recalled a particular impoverished widow, wrongly treated by a cunning tradesman. He had delivered the proper judgment, following the letter precisely, but he hadn't defended the woman with the passion that fairness required. He had protected himself behind procedures, and that, he now grasped, was also preferring shadow, taking shelter in the comfortable dimness of position to escape the scandal of illumination, which reveals, corrects, and reshapes. The illumination, he understood in that instant, not only exposes shocking transgressions, it unmasks timid neutrality, courteous neglect, the devotion that dreads human opinion more than divine observation. And from where he stood, Nicodemus perceived the cost. Approaching the illumination would mean aligning himself with reality, and reality in that moment bore a name that the council mistrusted, dismissed, and dreaded. The Pharisee gripped the edges of his cloak as though trying to clutch something that was slipping from his grasp. His inner voice stirred. Through the years, he had constructed a standing for equilibrium and careful judgment. He understood how to select the proper words, soften disputes, and avoid becoming the subject of gossip in the corridors of religious authority. But if the illumination required expression, that equilibrium started to resemble indifference. That carefulness looked like cowardice. That standing became a kind of shield that kept him from bowing down. He lifted his gaze toward Jesus. There was no trace of blame on the Nazarene's face, only a steady, undeniable clarity. The illumination didn't manipulate with emotional pressure. It beckoned with reality, and that reality both drew him in and filled him with dread. All who practice wickedness despise the illumination. Nicodemus was aware of wickedness he strongly rejected: bribery, impurity, sacrilege. But what about when wickedness wore the disguise of correctness? What about when wickedness was the preservation of a structure that banished compassion to safeguard stability? How frequently had he concealed himself behind legal opinions, regulations, careful judgment? How many occasions had he sidestepped inquiries that would disturb his settled beliefs? How many times had he chosen not to observe? The evening breeze rustled the olive foliage, and the sound resembled pages being turned. He thought of Moses once more, not merely raising the serpent, but stepping into the tent of encounter, where glory radiated, and a man had to remove his footwear. Illumination requires self-abandonment. No disguises, no designations. Whoever draws near is observed, and observing oneself this way can wound. The eyes of Nicodemus grew damp. For the first occasion in years, he experienced shame not because of his visible offenses. He had kept his distance from those, but because of the concealed corners of his soul, his self-importance, his self-reliance, his private pleasure at being praised, his willingness to require from others what he himself evaded: danger, dedication, trust. Jesus didn't interrupt the quiet. He didn't provide easy exits. He didn't diminish the summons. Whoever practices reality approaches the illumination. The statement called for resolution: practice reality. It wasn't a fleeting feeling, nor a scholarly understanding. It was a journey, a discipline, a conclusive transformation in existence. Approaching the illumination meant permitting God to scrutinize his intentions, reorganize his attachments, direct his movements. And this, for a man as prominent as he was, carried a steep cost, perhaps extremely steep. Nicodemus pictured the following day. He pictured stares in the council chamber, murmurs in the passageways, cunning inquiries at public assemblies. Have you been associating with him? He envisioned unspoken headlines passing from one person's lips to another's ear. He sensed the burden that would descend upon his household. Would his relatives, so proud of his reputation, endure it? Would his wife comprehend? Would his companions withdraw? Would students charge him with abandoning heritage? The cost was not merely professional, it was personal. And yet, the opposing side of the balance now carried irresistible weight. The illumination he had discovered was not a brilliant concept, it was presence. And presence, once perceived, makes absence intolerable. How could he go back to the refined routine of intellectual exchanges now that he had listened to the heartbeat of heaven? How could he accumulate references when the living word stood before him? How could he conceal himself in respectable shadows when clarity was already penetrating within? A straightforward, almost innocent thought crossed his awareness. What if I simply approach the illumination? The simplicity of this possibility frightened him more than any careful analysis. Approaching the illumination, so straightforward and yet so expensive. He considered the destitute who had rushed to Jesus without agreements, the afflicted who had stretched out without assurances, the wrongdoers who had wept without go-betweens. And there, where he had always taken pride in screening everything, he recognized that perhaps God was requesting something that young ones grasp before scholars: reliance. The evening continued. Time appeared suspended, as though the heavenly timepiece had decelerated so the meeting could settle completely within the soul of one person. Jesus finally spoke once more, with a tenderness that didn't reduce the requirements but disclosed the motivation. The Father longs for you to approach. The illumination has not arrived to uncover you for disgrace, but to release you from that which holds you distant from Him. The statement, though not preserved in any document, landed on Nicodemus as a pledge. The Father longed for it. The illumination longed for it. The invitation was not rooted in disdain, but in affection. An affection that addresses by name, not to degrade, but to restore. Still, the cost persisted. Approaching meant abandoning something, perhaps much, behind. He drew a deep breath. The old pattern of measuring every outcome returned briefly, like a reflex that refused to fade. But something, silently, had already escaped control. How could he justify to himself that staying in the shadows now would be a form of withering? How could he persuade his own chest to exist without air after drawing its first genuine breath? In the garden, the breeze moved once more. It wasn't powerful, but it shifted everything that could be shifted. Foliage, particles, recollections, opposition. Nicodemus understood that the breeze didn't request permission to exist. It simply arrived, and its arrival was vitality. Perhaps trust was similar, not a flawless equation, but an authentic movement. Not a finished argument, but a yielding that brightens the road as one travels. He bowed his head, his silhouette stretched across the earth outlined by moonlight, a precise picture of the struggle burning inside him, shadow and illumination touching, competing for territory within the shape of a single person. For the first occasion, he perceived clearly that his existence had been arranged to make shadow appear like ease. The illumination, however, disclosed the expense of that ease. Emptiness, anxiety, remoteness. When he finally raised his gaze, he still encountered the eyes of Jesus, unwavering, tender, radiant. There was no haste, but there was pressing need. There was no coercion, but there was reality. The illumination didn't require spectacle, it required resolution. A resolution that would commence there, without sound, but that eventually would manifest itself to the world. The garden appeared small compared to the enormity of what hung in the balance. Nicodemus sensed, like someone who perceives the changing breeze before a tempest, that nothing would ever remain unchanged. The cost of illumination lay before him, unavoidable, without compromise. And the inquiry, now as much his own as the words that sparked it. It could no longer be delayed. Would he venture to emerge from the shadows or stay torn? The following days flowed like a sluggish, weighty current, and Nicodemus couldn't dismiss from his thoughts the evening he had encountered Jesus. Words about spiritual rebirth, about the Son of Man raised high, about the illumination that requires resolution, returned in surges, invading unexpected instances. He attempted to maintain his routine, attend the council gatherings, preserve his bearing as a respected instructor. But deep within, something no longer aligned. In the assemblies, while others deliberated interpretations of religious law or the dangers of allowing Jesus to remain free among the populace, Nicodemus stayed more hushed than typical. He listened carefully, weighing every statement his colleagues uttered. Some spoke of Jesus with contempt, others with fury, a few with hesitation. And he, with what voice could he speak? His soul could no longer regard him simply as a disputed instructor. What he had absorbed that evening no longer fit within the detached structure of political and religious discussions. In the quiet of his own residence, he walked back and forth, sensing himself caught between two realms. On one side, the safety of his seat in the council, the distinction of his household, the steadiness that permitted him to exercise authority. On the other, his emerging conviction, delicate but breathing, driving him towards something larger and more perilous. He recalled the words, "Whoever practices reality approaches the illumination." And as he repeated them, he sensed a heaviness. Approaching the illumination meant being observed, and being observed meant being interrogated, and being interrogated could mean being cast aside. The dilemma intensified. Throughout the day, he sustained a peaceful appearance, participated in communal prayers, and listened to and commented on the scriptures with his customary authority. But in the earliest hours of morning, when everything grew silent, he would once more sense that living presence of his exchange with Jesus. It was as though between one day and the following, there existed an emptiness that only his voice could occupy. And yet he did not seek him once more. Not from absence of longing, but from anxiety. A portion of him reasoned that he required more time, more carefulness, more readiness before revealing himself. Another portion, quiet but persistent, declared that time spent waiting to comply is also time spent opposing. He started to perceive a kind of aching irony. He had devoted his whole existence teaching people to identify God's indicators, and now, when the most evident indicator stood before him, he wavered. His own statements and teachings were returning as witnesses against him. In the council, speculation about Jesus expanded. Accounts of wonders multiplied, and the gatherings grew ever larger. For some members, this was evidence that he needed to be restrained. For others, it was a political threat, as Rome disapproved of popular movements. Nicodemus absorbed everything, and each assault against Jesus stirred his desire to step in. But he didn't. His quiet there resembled an internal battleground. On one side, the longing to stand up for him. On the other, the anxiety of becoming a target alongside him. And this quiet began to develop its own existence. It wasn't merely an absence of speech. It was a perpetual waiting, like a secret demanding to be disclosed, but one hesitates to reveal. The more he stayed silent, the more he recognized his silence was becoming a selection, not merely a safeguard. In the place of worship, as he listened to readings from the prophets, he sensed as though each passage addressed him directly. Isaiah speaking of illumination for the nations, Jeremiah summoning for a renewed heart, Ezekiel depicting the life-giving Spirit. Everything appeared to direct back to the man he had encountered in the hushed evening. The connection was inescapable and yet too dangerous to acknowledge openly. Privately, his wife observed the transformation. He spoke less, appeared distracted, and sometimes gazed into the distance, as though attempting to perceive something only he could perceive. But Nicodemus didn't reveal what was occurring, perhaps out of safeguarding, perhaps out of anxiety of not being comprehended. The quiet, which had once been protection, was starting to feel like confinement. He listened to his colleagues discuss Jesus as though he were merely a difficulty to be resolved, and each occasion he sensed a sharp pain. He understood that partly this hostility originated from the same source as his former self-importance, the anxiety of losing command. Deep within, Nicodemus could no longer reject that he held conviction, even if he couldn't articulate it completely. Holding conviction without action resembles grasping a flame concealed in your pocket. It burns from within, and eventually it will either fade or ignite. Gradually, the dilemma was no longer merely between illumination and shadow, but between conviction and avoidance. An ancient verse resonated in his recollection: "Let all flesh be hushed before the Lord," but he was starting to recognize another difficult reality. There were occasions when silence wasn't reverence, it was flight, and perhaps staying silent would be the most subtle manner of distancing oneself from reality. The council chamber was crowded that morning. The heavy air, thick with burning incense and palpable anxiety, signaled that this gathering held unusual significance. Hushed exchanges filled the side chambers, and the most prominent figures had already claimed their seats, their countenances grim and resolute. The matter before them needed no announcement before formal proceedings began. The Nazarene teacher called Jesus. Over the preceding weeks, word of his movements through Jerusalem had spread rapidly. He had been addressing crowds within the temple grounds, and people listened with rapt fascination. Some departed filled with awe, others seething with anger, but indifference was impossible. The temple guards dispatched to observe him returned bearing a troubling admission: "Never in our lives have we encountered anyone who speaks as this man does." This declaration, whispered through corridors and echoed in marketplaces, only intensified the fury of those in authority. The chief priest launched the proceedings with a commanding tone. "The current situation demands immediate action. This individual sows confusion among our people and threatens our stability. Should we delay further, widespread chaos becomes inevitable." Nicodemus maintained an impassive exterior, while his heart thundered within his chest. Each accusation hurled brought memories flooding back of solitary evenings spent contemplating everything Jesus had shared with him. He recalled those tranquil eyes, that natural authority requiring no display of force. Reconciling that composed, gentle presence with the dangerous agitator being portrayed by his fellow council members proved impossible. A particularly agitated Sanhedrin member brought his fist crashing down. "We previously sent men to apprehend him, yet they returned having accomplished nothing. How do we explain this failure? Has this man bewitched everyone who approaches him? Can no one perceive the danger he represents?" The murmuring swelled in volume. Hostility filled the chamber, directed not merely toward Jesus, but toward any voice that might hesitate before pronouncing guilt. Nicodemus recognized the implications clearly. Speaking in opposition meant painting a target upon oneself. A highly regarded scribe inclined forward in his seat. "The path forward presents no complexity. We dispatch guards once more with orders to seize him. Failure will not be tolerated this time." The gravity of seas settled over the assembly like a shroud. Apprehending Jesus would initiate formal legal proceedings, and the typical outcome when religious teachers faced accusations of misleading the faithful was well understood by all present. Swift and merciless judgment. Nicodemus perceived with clarity that fair deliberation held no interest for this council. Only a predetermined outcome awaited validation. The true stakes extended far beyond theological disagreement. Raw power hung in the balance. At precisely that instant, a guard burst through the entrance. Nervousness was etched across his features. Approaching with deference, yet speaking almost apologetically, he declared, In all our experience, no person has ever communicated the way this individual does. The stillness that descended was absolute and piercing. The chief priest fixed him with an incredulous stare. "You too have succumbed to his deception," he thundered. "Has he captured your allegiance as well?" Suspicious gazes swept the chamber, hunting for betrayers within their own ranks. Nicodemus experienced the mounting pressure with every heartbeat. Each passing moment revealed more clearly that Jesus faced judgment not for his deeds, but for the disquiet his presence stirred among those clutching positions of influence. Several Pharisees responded with derisive laughter. "Which of our ruling class or religious scholars has embraced his teachings? Only this ignorant rabble unfamiliar with sacred law falls under his spell, and they already stand condemned." Nicodemus pressed his fingernails into his palms beneath his robes. His command of religious law was comprehensive, yet he equally understood that throughout history, the Almighty had repeatedly selected improbable vessels for accomplishing divine purposes. His thoughts turned to prophets of earlier ages who suffered rejection, men who paid dearly for delivering messages from on high. Briefly, he envisioned Jesus traveling that identical road of suffering. Every instinct urged him forward, compelled him to advocate at minimum for the right of Jesus to present his own defense before sentencing. Yet he restrained himself. The peril was undeniable. Reckless intervention risked transforming him into a suspect alongside the accused. Nevertheless, something smoldered deep within, an unquenchable thirst for justice that refused permanent suppression. The assembly proceeded with accusations growing increasingly savage, voices climbing in volume, impassioned denunciations, hand-picked legal citations marshaled to justify swift punishment. Space for measured reflection evaporated entirely. Throughout these proceedings, the name Nicodemus remained inscribed among the 70, representing a potential deciding vote in determining the fate of Jesus. He observed the familiar countenances of men alongside whom he had served for years. Yet now, with unprecedented clarity, he perceived an invisible boundary taking shape. On one flank stood illumination. On the other lurked shadow disguised as righteous devotion to sacred tradition. The inevitable moment of decision approached, and Nicodemus remained numbered among those holding power over the outcome. The atmosphere pervading the council chamber had grown so oppressive it seemed almost tangible. Accusations targeting Jesus resounded like repeated hammer strikes, each iteration landing with amplified force. Evidence received no mention whatsoever, only pressing urgency. This man requires silencing. The populace suffers deception at his hands. Permitting this situation to continue is unacceptable. The normally dignified setting now resembled a tribunal where verdicts preceded any examination of facts. Nicodemus observed without uttering a syllable. Internally, however, each condemning phrase struck like hurled stones, wounding not Jesus alone, but everything Nicodemus himself had begun embracing. The accumulated burden of recent weeks, those words absorbed during that fateful evening, the ongoing struggle between illumination and shadow, bore down crushingly upon his chest. The protective silence he had long maintained was transforming into an unbearable weight. Among the most influential members, one rose declaring with finality, "Further deliberation serves no purpose. Guards have verified his presence at the temple. We shall apprehend him immediately and conclude this matter before popular unrest intensifies further." Multiple heads nodded while voices murmured approval. The opportunity to resolve everything presented itself perfectly. Yet in that precise instant, something within Nicodemus shattered the barrier, keeping him concealed in shadow. Delivering an impassioned defense of Jesus lay beyond possibility, he recognized. Such action would constitute political annihilation. Perhaps, however, he might pose a single inquiry, reminding his colleagues that their own legal traditions demanded proper procedure. Drawing breath deeply before another voice could seize the floor, he spoke. Does the law we uphold permit passing judgment upon anyone without first granting him opportunity to speak and establishing what actions he has taken? Momentary stillness gripped the chamber. Though falling short of outright defense, every person present grasped the underlying meaning. He made no proclamation of innocence regarding Jesus. Rather, he asserted that legitimate verdicts required first permitting the accused to testify. A subtle yet unmistakable boundary separated careful neutrality from active advocacy. Uncomfortable glances passed between some members, while others wore expressions of irritation. The stillness proved brief. From among the most rigid Pharisees, one leaned forward, his manner dripping with condescension. Perhaps you hail from Galilee yourself? Investigate thoroughly, and you shall discover no prophet has ever emerged from Galilee. These words transcended mere rebuttal. They constituted a calculated attempt to discredit Nicodemus, casting suspicion upon his loyalties. Within this circle, association with Galilee represented far more than geographical reference. It approached outright insult. Galilee, according to prevailing opinion, harbored uneducated masses lacking both sophistication and the religious refinement characteristic of Jerusalem's elite. The implicit accusation carried unmistakable clarity. Speaking thus, Nicodemus had perhaps secretly aligned himself with that Galilean outsider. Whispered conversations intensified, accompanied by mocking laughter and knowing sideways glances. Nicodemus registered each response as though invisible projectiles were being launched in his direction. Within this assembly of legal scholars and religious authorities, reputation constituted the most precious possession. Suffering public ridicule equated to watching personal credibility disintegrate before assembled peers. Though striving to preserve composure, internal pain demanded acknowledgement. Beyond the mere sting of spoken words lay something deeper. A silent recognition surfaced that for extended years he had counted himself among these very men, sharing not merely position but fundamental outlook. How frequently had he personally regarded with contempt colleagues appearing to champion unpopular positions? How regularly had he deployed cutting sarcasm to secure argumentative victories? Now, occupying the opposing position, the blade he had wielded with such expertise was carving into his own being. The contempt demonstrated calculated precision through its Galilean association. Beyond suggesting flawed reasoning, they challenged his heritage, his discernment, his fundamental allegiances. Among Jerusalem's religious aristocracy, Galilee represented ignorance and ceremonial contamination, a territory producing only unsophisticated devotion expressed in crude dialect. Galilean origins signified, within their worldview, lacking refinement and the sanctity befitting the sacred capital. Nicodemus possessed intimate familiarity with this methodology. The Sanhedrin crushed opposition not through extended discourse, but via swift categorizations that obliterated standing instantaneously. Absorbing the impact, he simultaneously recognized their authentic objective, extended beyond demonstrating his error. Their purpose was intimidating him into withdrawal. His gaze traveled across surrounding faces. Some evaded his eyes, motivated not by disdain but by terror of identification as sympathizers. Others met his stare directly, wordlessly daring response. The atmosphere had abandoned any pretense of impartial assembly, transformed instead into a tribunal having reached conclusions prior to examining testimony. Internally, opposing forces collided violently. The first embodied self-preservation, murmuring urgently, retreat immediately. Additional exposure serves no purpose. Allow others to suffer consequences in this conflict. This voice invoked family obligations, hard-won reputation, doors destined for permanent closure should association with Jesus become public knowledge. It conjured visions of bleak futures, forfeited influence, abandoned friendships, potentially even expulsion from the council itself. The second voice originated from deeper wells, proving far more difficult to suppress. It refrained from shouting, yet carried undeniable weight, demanding attention. Your heart recognizes he spoke authentically. Your conscience affirms justice requires granting him hearing. This voice summoned memories of that evening conversation with Jesus, the radiance animating his eyes while discussing the kingdom, the profound calm underlying his declaration that illumination had entered the world. This same voice ignited within his chest whenever injustice paraded wearing masks of religious fervor. Nicodemus experienced his throat constricting. His colleagues' assault targeted not merely his person. At its essence, it opposed any possibility of Jesus receiving equitable treatment. Through ridiculing him, the Sanhedrin broadcast unmistakable communication to all observers. Questioning condemnation of Jesus meant volunteering as a target. He maintained his silence, not from absence of response, but from recognition that any utterance would suffer immediate distortion. The window for speaking had closed. The chamber overflowed with antagonism. Occasionally, restraint proved wiser than attempting to outshout a gathering that had already determined its verdict. Yet his quiet stance did not erase its significance. On the contrary, it sparked fresh awareness within him. The direction he had selected, however tentatively, was already carrying him beyond his former zone of safety. Complete return to impartiality no longer existed as an option. Even should he utter nothing further, he had already been identified, and somewhere deep inside, this recognition liberated him from a false belief. Satisfying both factions simultaneously had become impossible. Throughout the subsequent days, suspicious glances persisted. During smaller assemblies, he detected whispered conversations upon his entrance. Certain colleagues appeared to shun his presence. Others engaged him with frigid courtesy. An unseen fracture had emerged between him and the circle that had previously embraced him unconditionally. Simultaneously, Nicodemus experienced an unexpected tranquility. The council's disdain wounded him, yet something in the recollection of what Jesus had spoken provided endurance. He understood that the cost of illumination included forfeiting human approval. The lingering uncertainty remained. Would he prove willing to bear that cost until the very end? Certain evenings, that question robbed him of sleep. He mentally relived the instant he had risen to speak, the murmuring that ensued, the mocking tenor of the response he received. What if more words had been offered? What if his defense had been more forthright? Perhaps a fiercer reaction would have erupted. Perhaps his seat would have been forfeited, yet perhaps greater justice would have been served. Shame, dread, and conviction waged warfare within him, and each successive day heightened the conflict. Space for innocence had vanished. Association with Jesus, however subtle, invited scorn, danger, and solitude. What Nicodemus could not yet foresee was that pressure would soon become overwhelming. A moment would arrive when cautious inquiries and measured silences would no longer suffice. When that hour struck, neutral ground would cease to exist. Would shame drive him backward or propel him forward? The city had transformed. Jerusalem, perpetually bustling during Passover season, now appeared to carry an invisible heaviness in the atmosphere. Pilgrims arrived from distant regions, bringing festive anticipation, yet also whispers of something that might alter the trajectory of all things. Streets teemed with bodies, voices blended with hymns and speculation, and sentries occupied every corner, not merely preserving order, but maintaining vigilance. Nicodemus navigated the alleyways, observing the commotion, yet his thoughts dwelt elsewhere than commerce or celebration preparations. He recognized that beneath the festive activity, another scheme was unfolding, a scheme targeting the man he had encountered one evening beneath the veil of darkness and who had occupied his thoughts ever since, Jesus of Nazareth. Council gatherings had grown more frequent and increasingly charged with animosity. Discussion no longer centered on evaluating or monitoring Jesus, but on moving swiftly and decisively. Patience among the leaders had exhausted itself. For numerous members, he represented not merely theological controversy, but political menace, capable of igniting popular uprising and drawing Roman fury upon the nation. Nicodemus absorbed their strategizing and detected the shifting tone. Previously, discourse had maintained caution. Now, urgency dominated. Betrayal had moved beyond possibility into active execution. Whispers that one among the followers had approached authorities grew increasingly persistent. The precise timing remained uncertain, yet the arrest of Jesus was assured. Within him, the internal struggle intensified. He recognized that continued silence would preserve his standing and perhaps allow him to pass unnoticed. Yet he equally recognized that each silent footstep he took represented another stride along the road, leading Jesus toward Calvary. This awareness gnawed relentlessly. On the evening of the seizure, when word reached the council chambers, Nicodemus felt his insides twist. Jesus had been taken, betrayed through a kiss in Gethsemane. He envisioned the scene, torch flames illuminating, faces rigid with tension, armed soldiers, followers scattered in confusion and terror. The Son of Man, who had spoken of spiritual rebirth and the Father's affection, now stood bound, led away as though he were a common criminal. The questioning proceeded rapidly and without mercy. Deceitful witnesses stepped forward, twisting words and actions. Nicodemus, present for portions of the proceedings, perceived clearly that justice played no role in what transpired. The haste toward condemnation, the absence of legitimate proof, the contempt for the very legal principles they professed to champion, all burned like flames within his chest. He contemplated speaking out, repeating the inquiry he had posed previously: does our legal code condemn someone without first granting them hearing? Yet he recognized that the current was mightier than any argument in that moment. The council sought no truth. It sought only a verdict. As Jesus was escorted from one hearing to another, Nicodemus observed the noose drawing tighter. The council delivered him to Pilate. Pilate dispatched him to Herod, then back to Pilate he went. It resembled a merciless game where none wished sole responsibility, yet all desired identical results. Each rotation of this cycle deepened the sense of helplessness Nicodemus carried. Throughout the streets, crowds began stirring. Some cried out for his release, others, manipulated by the priests, demanded his execution. Nicodemus identified certain faces that mere days earlier had gathered at the temple to absorb every word Jesus spoke. Now, bewildered or coerced, they joined the chorus of hatred. He perceived how swiftly public sentiment could be molded, how illumination could be distorted until it appeared as shadow, and shadow as illumination. Moments arose when Nicodemus contemplated approaching Jesus, whatever the consequences. Yet the barrier of dread remained, dread of identification, dread of losing everything he had constructed, dread of lacking strength to face what lay ahead. He existed as though caught between twin chains, one drawing him toward the illumination he had already recognized, the other straining to anchor him in comfortable shadows. Reports of the flogging reached him like strikes against his own body. Jesus had been scourged until his flesh split open in grievous wounds. The thorn crown pressed into his scalp sent blood cascading down his features. Nicodemus shut his eyes and struggled to banish the image, yet found it impossible regardless of where he stood. The scene pursued him relentlessly. When Pilate presented Jesus before the assembly and declared, "Observe this man," Nicodemus understood no reversal remained possible. The governor's acquiescence, pressure from religious leaders, the crowds clamoring, all pointed toward a singular fate. Confronting this certainty, he experienced a crushing burden. With each stride Jesus took toward Golgotha, his own silence grew louder, more accusatory. A peculiar sensation gripped him, being positioned inside the decision-making circles, possessing access to private deliberations, while simultaneously feeling like an observer, powerless to alter the unfolding narrative. As the Nazarene's destiny was sealed, Nicodemus bore the bitter understanding that the cross was being constructed not merely with timber and iron, but with failures to act, moral weakness, and terror. The day of crucifixion drew near, and with it a voiceless inquiry that granted him no rest. How long can the heart endure without taking action? The courtyard hosting the proceedings glowed with torch flame, casting wavering shadows upon stone surfaces. The smell of burning materials blended with humid pre-dawn air. Within, in the hall where leaders assembled, the climate extended beyond tension into open hostility. Space for uncertainty or debate had evaporated. The atmosphere carried a determination formed before any testimony was offered. Nicodemus observed from peripheral positions, his features partly concealed by dimness. He recognized that merely being present created risk, yet withdrawal proved impossible. Not because he imagined altering the proceedings. Deep within, he accepted that probability was minimal, yet something internal prevented him from abandoning that moment. His very soul seemed to bear witness. At the center stood Jesus, wrists restrained, face bearing evidence of initial mistreatment suffered during detention. Nevertheless, his bearing remained upright and his gaze unwavering. Those eyes contained no terror, no panic, no desperation, only a calmness that itself served as silent indictment of this entire judicial theater. The high priest initiated questioning. "I demand information regarding your followers and the teachings people have heard. What doctrines do you spread?" His voice cut sharply, laden with purpose. Seeking clarification held no interest, only setting snares, extracting statements that could be manipulated and wielded as formal charges. Jesus responded with simplicity, "I have communicated openly before the world. My instruction has always occurred in synagogues and temple grounds where all gather. Nothing I have spoken remained hidden. Why direct these questions to me? Inquire of those who heard my words. They possess knowledge of what I said." The clarity of his response reverberated throughout the space. Jesus employed no evasion. Self-protection was absent from his approach. He confronted the tribunal with its proper obligation to hear authentic testimony. Essentially, he challenged the legitimacy of these entire proceedings. The stillness that followed shattered quickly with a sharp sound. One guard, enraged by the response, struck Jesus viciously across the face. The impact echoed throughout the chamber. "You dare address the high priest this way?" the man bellowed, his expression mingling hatred with satisfaction. Nicodemus felt his blood surge. Every instinct for righteousness within him cried out for intervention. The legal code everyone present claimed to uphold explicitly prohibited striking defendants during questioning, especially prior to any conviction. He could recite the precise text, chapter and verse. He could expose the violation before all assembled. In that instant, he could become the voice halting the abuse. Yet he spoke nothing. Jesus, his face marked by the blow, addressed the guard with identical composure. If my words contained evil, provide testimony of the evil. Yet if my words were proper, why do you strike me?" The statement hung suspended like a weight. No shouting emerged, no curses, merely truth spoken with impossible calmness. That composure cut more deeply than any heated defense could have achieved. Yet for the council, this proved insufficient. Persuasion held no interest for them. They desired only justification for executing the decision already residing in their hearts. Nicodemus remained frozen. Internally, a voiceless battle raged. His intellect screamed that these proceedings violated legality, that the rush toward condemnation transgressed every principle they had. Vowed to maintain, his heart pleaded with him to rise, to employ his position, to demand proper procedure at minimum. Yet his lips stayed sealed. The burden of silence assumed almost physical weight. He experienced sensations of betraying not merely Jesus, but everything he had absorbed regarding justice since earliest years. Nevertheless, dread spoke with volume. Dread of forfeiting his council seat. Dread of association with the accused. Dread of drawing his household into disgrace. He recognized that stepping forward now would permit no retreat. His standing, assembled across decades, would crumble within days. As proceedings advanced, deceitful witnesses rotated, each providing different and contradictory accounts. The absence of solid evidence was obvious, yet none appeared willing to acknowledge it. The urgency toward condemnation overwhelmed any desire to hear truth. Nicodemus recognized with bitterness that they were judging more than a man. They were judging truth itself made flesh, and they were ruling against it. Jesus was led away for subsequent stages of the process, and Nicodemus remained behind. He watched the departure, guards surrounding the figure, torch flame reflecting off ropes binding those hands. That vision etched itself into his mind with painful sharpness. He recognized that henceforth claiming ignorance was impossible. He could not assert he had witnessed nothing. He could not pretend comprehension had escaped him. When the chamber emptied, Nicodemus still occupied his original position, fingers gripping the armrest, as though bracing against descent into an abyss. Outside, night continued its progression, yet inside, time appeared suspended. He perceived that Jesus was not the sole subject of trial that evening. He himself faced judgment, his character, his courage, his faithfulness, and the inquiry grew increasingly unbearable. Did his standing hold greater value, or his soul? The sun hung high, yet illumination seemed peculiar that day. Jerusalem's arid air carried suffocating heat, mingled with foreboding that pressed heavily upon the city. From earliest hours, whispers had circulated through streets. Jesus of Nazareth was being led to execution. People emerged from dwellings, not merely to observe, but to participate, whether from morbid fascination or hatred ignited by words that had been spoken. Nicodemus moved among the throng, yet maintained distance. Being seen near the procession held no appeal, yet remaining apart proved equally impossible. With each footfall, he recalled the evening he had conversed with Jesus beneath darkness's cover, the words regarding spiritual rebirth, regarding illumination, regarding the Son of Man who would be raised high. Now that imagery had abandoned metaphor. The raising was imminent, not in visible magnificence, but through the brutality of execution. Along the path to Calvary, Jesus bore the horizontal beam, the heavy timber pressing him earthward. His body already bore wounds from scourging. His skin, marked by gashes and bruises, revealed the savagery he had endured. The thorn crown remained embedded in his scalp, blood streaming down his face and mingling with perspiration and road dust. Nicodemus watched him stumble and collapse, crushed beneath the burden. An impatient Roman soldier yanked a bystander from the common folk, Simon of Cyrene, compelling him to assist with bearing the crossbeam. The procession continued, each stride seeming more burdensome than the previous. Women sobbed along the roadside, some hurled mockery, others shouted contempt. Nicodemus identified certain voices among them. These were identical voices that days earlier had celebrated Jesus during his entrance to the city. The disparity struck him like a fresh injury. The fickleness of human favor proved merciless. Upon reaching the location called Golgotha, a hilltop of exposed rock, the execution commenced with unsettling precision. The Roman soldiers possessed extensive experience, their actions nearly mechanical. Nicodemus, positioned at a careful remove, absorbed every detail with mingled revulsion and helplessness. The sound of iron piercing timber and flesh reverberated, compelling him to shut his eyes momentarily. The upright beam already stood anchored in the earth. The crossbeam, now bearing the body of Jesus fastened to it, was hoisted and joined together, completing the cross. The jarring impact caused his frame to shudder. The placard positioned above declared, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," inscribed in Hebrew, Latin and Greek, ensuring universal comprehension. The chief priests objected, demanding it read, "He claimed to be King of the Jews," yet Pilate preserved the wording unchanged. Nicodemus perceived, even from his distance, that this declaration, whether intended or not, proclaimed a reality that even Roman authority could not obliterate. The spectacle was savage, yet something commanded Nicodemus's attention unavoidably, the manner in which Jesus appeared. Even suspended there, his frame depleted and battered, dignity remained alongside an inexplicable serenity. No curses escaped him, no screams of hatred emerged, no demands for vengeance arose. Instead, he lifted his gaze heavenward and spoke, "Father, extend forgiveness to them, for they lack understanding of their actions." These words penetrated Nicodemus like an unseen blade. How could anyone, amid such agony, contemplate pardoning others? How could he intercede for those actively tormenting him in that very instant? This transcended all human comprehension. Minutes seemed to stretch endlessly. The soldiers, displaying indifference, gambled for the garments of Jesus, while religious authorities taunted, "He rescued others, yet cannot rescue himself." With each provocation, Nicodemus experienced the crushing weight of his voicelessness. He yearned to cry out, to proclaim that they stood before the righteous one, that the injustice was unmistakable as sunlight. Yet, as during the proceedings, he remained frozen. Dread still imprisoned his speech. Then Jesus directed his gaze toward the woman near the cross, Mary, his mother, and toward his beloved follower. Even facing death, concern for others occupied him. "Woman, behold your son, behold your mother." Witnessing the enduring strength present there proved impossible to resist, a strength originating not from physical form, but from something vastly deeper. Nicodemus recalled the declaration, "No one removes my life from me. I surrender it by my own choosing." Now he observed this unfolding before him. The heavens commenced darkening, as though creation itself refused to witness what transpired. Daylight yielded to a darkness extending beyond the physical, appearing spiritual in nature. Tension mounted, and the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Then Jesus, with powerful voice, proclaimed, "It stands completed," and lowering his head, released his spirit. The stillness that ensued was nearly total, interrupted only by distant wind sounds. Nicodemus sensed the entire world transforming in that instant. Full comprehension eluded him, yet he recognized something irreversible had occurred. The Son of Man had been raised high, precisely as he had declared. The prophecy had reached fulfillment, and the price had been rendered. He lingered there for additional moments, observing. Movement was beyond him. The body hung motionless, yet within the eyes of Nicodemus resided a peculiar certainty. This account somehow would not conclude here, because something in that gaze would not perish there. The instant of Jesus' death saturated the atmosphere with silence, bearing tremendous weight. This extended beyond mere absence of sound. It was a dense stillness, as though all existence held its breath. The surrounding crowd, previously clamorous, had grown restless. Some withdrew, others remained stationary, gazing at the cross as though struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. The heavens, once brilliant with daylight, remained shrouded in peculiar dimness. Neither night nor day described it accurately. A strange shadow enveloped Jerusalem, and even the most doubtful whispered of portents. The wind carried a chill, and the ground appeared to tremble slightly, as though nature itself acknowledged the gravity of this moment. Nicodemus remained immobile. Since arriving at Golgotha, approaching the cross had proven impossible. He positioned himself at a distance, permitting observation of everything, while perhaps avoiding notice himself. His gaze fixed upon the now lifeless form, suspended beneath death's burden. The inscription remained positioned above, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. For the first occasion, he recognized that these words, placed there as political mockery, conveyed a reality that no Roman implement could eliminate. Memory of the evening when Jesus had spoken to him regarding the Son of Man being raised high returned with force. At that time, complete understanding had escaped him. Now observing the elevated cross, the prophecy aligned like the concluding piece of a puzzle. Academic explanations held no necessity. What stood before his vision was the fulfillment, and he had uttered nothing. Around them, soldiers were already dismantling portions of the scene. Some maintained guard duty over the bodies. Others attended to mechanical routines accompanying each execution. The women, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and others positioned themselves nearby, weeping silently or with suppressed sobbing. Several followers lingered there, concealed among the gathering, watching from distance. The Roman centurion, a man hardened through years of service, regarded the cross with an altered expression. When he finally spoke, his voice resembled confession more than report. In truth, this man was the Son of God. Nicodemus received these words as though they constituted the final possible declaration. A Gentile, a foreign soldier, had managed to speak aloud what he, the instructor of Israel, had lacked courage to utter. The statement echoed within him as accusation, directed not merely at his conviction, but at his failure to act. Minutes crawled past. The cold appeared to deepen despite the hour. Nicodemus experienced not only atmospheric change, but inner emptiness, as though opportunity for speaking had vanished forever. He mentally revisited every occasion spent in the council, every chance for intervention, every instant he might have risen and spoken something. Throughout all those occasions, what had he declared? Nothing. His standing remained unblemished. He continued as a respected council member, still possessed status, still held his seat guaranteed at assemblies. Yet now he perceived that all of this bore the stain of complicit voicelessness. He also perceived that standing before men constituted useless weight compared to conscience before God. The subsequent hours were marked by confused murmuring and scattered movements of the gathering. Many descended the hill, avoiding loud speech, as though eager to distance themselves from a scene beginning to burden their thoughts. Others remained paralyzed, as though fearful that turning away would betray the one who had just perished. Nicodemus remained, not because departure was impossible, but because he could not bring himself to leave. His feet appeared anchored to the ground. He recognized something required doing, yet uncertainty clouded the specifics. The body remained fastened to the cross, and Roman regulation permitted its display as warning to others. The image of the Son of Man there, exposed to wind and dust, penetrated ever deeper into his being. Within his thoughts, the words of Jesus resonated not as distant recollection, but as living voice. God possessed such love for the world that he surrendered his only Son. He finally comprehended that he was witnessing the consummation of this affection, yet he equally comprehended that this affection required response. Regret commenced growing like flames. This extended beyond sorrow for what he witnessed, becoming acute pain from recognizing he had been present behind the scenes of condemnation, yet had selected voicelessness. He was not alone in this, yet that diminished his responsibility not at all. The failure to act belonged to him alone. As the body of Jesus remained suspended, the magnitude of what had occurred descended upon him like stone. Tomorrow's circumstances remained unknown, yet one certainty was expanding. Continuing as mere observer had become impossible. Anguish pierced him, yet within it resided something different, a strange energy, an impulse not yet understood, yet which was beginning to override his dread. Regret can prove mightier than anguish. The body of Jesus still hung upon the cross when movement at Golgotha commenced shifting. The sun was already descending, and mountain shadow was lengthening across the valley. Jewish law prescribed that bodies be removed before sunset, particularly since the eve of Sabbath approached, and not merely any Sabbath but Passover. Maintaining an exposed body would constitute defilement of the land and scandal to sacred custom. At this juncture, a man esteemed among the leaders, Joseph of Arimathea, reached a courageous resolution. He was not merely a concealed follower of Jesus, he was an honored council member. Until that point, he had maintained silent conviction, precisely as Nicodemus had, yet that day voicelessness became unbearable for him. As many dispersed, Joseph departed the hill and walked steadily toward the praetorium, the official residence of Pontius Pilate. This constituted a dangerous gesture. Requesting the body of someone condemned to crucifixion could be interpreted as complicity or endorsement of his teachings. Nevertheless, Joseph entered. His voice remained steady as he made the petition. "I seek authorization to remove and inter the body of Jesus of Nazareth." Pilate, taken aback by this boldness, sought confirmation that Jesus had already expired. He summoned a centurion for verification. The response arrived swiftly. Indeed, he had perished. Pilate thereupon granted authorization. Joseph of Arimathea departed bearing an official document, yet carrying something of greater weight, the certainty that he had crossed an unseen boundary, transitioning from bystander to participant in history. Word reached Nicodemus while he remained at Golgotha. He had been observing from distance the activity of soldiers and the small clusters forming near the cross. Upon learning that Joseph had secured permission to take the body, something stirred deep within. Momentarily, he contemplated whether remaining an observer might suffice. After all, his presence held no practical necessity. Joseph had already exposed himself to risk, yet almost unconsciously, his feet commenced moving. Nicodemus refused to merely witness this concluding moment. He recalled every word he had received from Jesus and sensed an obligation to pay tribute somehow. If courage for defending him during life had escaped him, at minimum he could tend to his remains in death. He withdrew briefly and returned bearing something that drew attention from all who observed his passing, a blend of myrrh and aloes, approximately 34 kilograms, representing no modest sum. This quantity was reserved exclusively for the most distinguished burials, intended for monarchs, nobility, or men of exceptional standing. Myrrh, with its rich, profound fragrance, and aloes with its earthy essence, would serve to prepare the body and delay deterioration. This constituted a gesture of honor, yet also a voiceless proclamation. Through the eyes of Nicodemus, Jesus was no offender. He merited treatment befitting royalty. The scene that developed was extraordinary. Two esteemed council members, previously cautious regarding their convictions, now positioned together before the cross. Joseph brought authorization for removing the body. Nicodemus contributed the precious aromatics. The soldiers, accustomed to hasty executions and unceremonious disposals, observed with curiosity. Requests for bodies of condemned men came rarely, and preparation with such attentiveness came rarer still. With reverence they drew near. The undertaking demanded considerable effort. Extracting a body fastened with nails required both strength and exactness. Joseph and Nicodemus labored alongside one another, assisted by several servants. The sound of iron being withdrawn from timber resonated through the heavy stillness. The body of Jesus was lowered with care, and Nicodemus received it in his embrace, together with Joseph. The marks proved impossible to overlook. Shoulders raw from friction against the crossbeam, features swollen from beatings, the side pierced by a spear from which blood mingled with water still seeped. Nicodemus could not restrain his tears. As he wiped away portions of blood and grime with cloth, he recalled that this form had carried, in the words of Jesus himself, the burden of the world's wrongdoing. Throughout this process, speech remained minimal. The quietness stemmed not from anxiety, but from sacred respect. The hands of Nicodemus, trained for handling scrolls, for indicating passages of law to pupils, now bore stains from the blood of Jesus. Rather than repulsion, he experienced strange privilege, as though deemed worthy to touch what was most holy. The tomb belonging to Joseph occupied a nearby garden hewn from solid rock, newly made, never previously used. It offered dignified shelter, protected surroundings, and sufficient proximity to permit burial before Sabbath commenced. They transported the body with deliberation, wrapped in fresh linen cloths, while Nicodemus poured myrrh and aloes, saturating the fabric with their potent, sweet perfume. To any observer, this resembled a royal ceremony. The hands of Nicodemus displayed no haste. Every fold of linen, every layer of ointment, constituted an act of wordless devotion. At last, it seemed, he had discovered means to express what spoken words had never conveyed, that he held conviction, that he acknowledged truth, that he rendered honor. Several passers-by gazed with astonishment, yet maintained distance. Perhaps they feared contamination from contact with the deceased. Perhaps they shunned association with a condemned man's remains. Yet Joseph and Nicodemus had abandoned concern for public perception. Entering the tomb, they sensed cool air and soft echoes from stone walls. They positioned the body upon the stone ledge prepared for receiving the departed and adjusted the linens. The fragrance filled the confined space, blending with the stillness. Nicodemus paused motionless for a moment, gazing upon the face of Jesus. Life had departed, yet something persisted, a dignity impossible to erase, a tranquility that withstood even death's harshness. Joseph stepped aside to ready the stone that would seal the entrance. Nicodemus lingered a moment longer. He recognized this would be his final occasion beholding the body of Jesus. He wished to engrave every detail into memory, the scarred hands, the wounded brow, the inexplicable peace. Then he stepped backward, permitting the stone to be rolled into position. The heavy sound of rock sealing the entrance reverberated through the garden. Completion had arrived. The master lay entombed, yet as they departed, a voiceless question lingered. But what did this moment truly mean for Nicodemus? Let us look deeper into his heart during those final hours in the garden. Only soft wind sounds, stirring olive foliage, broke the heavy afternoon air. Following the crucifixion, many had scattered, carrying conviction that everything had concluded. Yet for Nicodemus, conclusion did not simply mean returning home. Something demanded action, something unimaginable until mere days prior. He bore in his grasp the weight of resolution and literally the weight of treasure, approximately 34 kilograms of myrrh, and aloes. This represented no ordinary measure. Sufficient quantity existed to prepare a monarch for burial. Within Jewish tradition, this aromatic combination held value not merely for fragrance, but for symbolic significance. It constituted a tribute of esteem, recognition of the departed's greatness. Nicodemus offered this not from mere piety or convention. It was a voiceless proclamation. For him, Jesus merited royal burial rites. Joseph of Arimathea already occupied the garden beside the fresh tomb he had carved from rock. His countenance bore identical determination as when confronting Pilate to request the body. Disguise no longer held necessity. Both understood that this gesture placed them in the sights of those who had condemned the master. Still, neither hesitated. When Nicodemus arrived, Joseph regarded him momentarily, as though words between them proved unnecessary for understanding. His presence, bearing that fragrant burden, spoke volumes. This exceeded mere offering. It represented definitive severance from the voicelessness that had plagued him for months. The body of Jesus lay there, still marked by suffering. Open wounds from scourging, the thorn crown that had pierced his brow, the nails that had penetrated hands and feet, everything remained visible before them. Nicodemus approached with reverence, almost as though treading sacred ground. His fingers, accustomed to parchment and scholarly discourse, now touched the cold, scarred skin of the man who had spoken to him about spiritual rebirth. While Joseph supported the body, Nicodemus commenced preparing the linen strips. The scent of myrrh and aloes permeated the atmosphere, dense and sweet, mingling with the damp coolness of the tomb. He worked with precision, yet also with tenderness. This was no mechanical ritual. Each cloth fold, each ointment application proceeded as though in wordless prayer. Haste had no presence. The outside world might bustle with Passover preparations, yet within that small stone chamber, time appeared suspended. Light streaming through the opening illuminated the face of Jesus, now peaceful, liberated from pain's tension. Nicodemus draped linen across the shoulders, covering wounds, wrapping the body with respect. At intervals he paused, not from physical weariness, but because tears clouded his vision. He recalled that initial evening, concealed in shadows, fearful of being observed. He recalled choosing to encounter Jesus when none were present, avoiding criticism's weight and the risk of forfeiting his counsel position. Now he stood there in daylight's full view, in an act visible to all. And strangely, no fear arose. Instead, liberation filled him. Others' opinions no longer mattered. Risk had not vanished, yet something greater had overcome it, a certainty not yet fully explicable, yet burning within. Perhaps this was what Jesus meant by spiritual rebirth. Not merely altered thinking, but transformed conduct, transformed heart, transformed existence. Joseph assisted in silence, yet his gaze communicated abundantly. These two men, previously concealed followers, now stood identifiable through their deeds. In that instant, titles, positions, and honors had vanished. Two servants remained, honoring their master. When the body was fully prepared, wrapped in fresh linen and saturated with spiced fragrance, they placed it upon the carved stone within the tomb. Nicodemus stepped backward, contemplating the scene. No monarch on golden throne occupied his view, yet greater dignity existed here than any ruler he had ever witnessed. The scent of myrrh and aloes would linger in the stone for days, perhaps weeks. Anyone entering would detect the fragrance before glimpsing the body. For Nicodemus, that aroma would become inseparable from memory of Jesus. A reminder that even in death existed beauty, dignity, and promise. As Joseph positioned himself to close the entrance with the massive stone, Nicodemus remained watching. He had approached the master as a curious man, secretly pursuing answers. Now he departed as one exposing himself publicly to render honor. What had once been concealed had now become visible action, and in that gesture, Nicodemus recognized his secret was not merely courage. It was living conviction. Centuries passed, empires ascended and collapsed, languages evolved, boundaries were redrawn. Yet the account of a Pharisee who encountered Jesus on a hushed evening and concluded by honoring him in daylight continues spanning generations. Today, examining Nicodemus, the contrast between journey's beginning and ending proves impossible to ignore. He commenced in shadows, guarding his standing and fearing consequences of being seen alongside the Master. Yet he concluded before everyone, touching the body of Jesus, bearing aromatics worthy of royalty, and entombing him with honor when many had fled. Existence is not measured by the initial step alone, but by the final. And in that concluding step, Nicodemus selected conviction over dread, honor over convenience. He reminds us that God does not dismiss the heart seeking him, even when beginning timidly or uncertainly. Courage is not fear's absence. It is acting despite fear, propelled by something greater, the certainty that the one we follow deserves everything. The voicelessness that had previously imprisoned him shattered not through passionate speeches, but through concrete deeds. When the moment arrived, Nicodemus required no spotlight or applause. His conviction spoke through his hands, through the burden he carried, through the care with which he tended the Savior's body. The lesson stands clear. Regardless of how fragile your conviction appears initially, what God honors is the resolution to finish faithfully. Perhaps you commenced with uncertainties, anxieties, and hesitant steps. Perhaps you avoided exposure, fearing criticism or loss. Yet if at any point you surrender and act for truth, heaven recognizes and records this deed. Nicodemus demonstrates that God can transform a wavering heart into a courageous one. Beyond this, he reveals that God honors those who hold conviction, even at the final moment, because ultimately, human opinions do not determine eternal worth. God's gaze upon us does, and he perceives with absolute clarity every movement of conviction, every act of surrender, every silent choice made from love for his Son. Whoever approaches Jesus, even in secret, will be remembered eternally. If this account resonated with your heart, 2 additional videos will appear on your screen featuring biblical figures who also experienced life-changing encounters with Jesus. Click subscribe to the channel and leave a like. May the God who granted Nicodemus courage to emerge from shadows and honor the body of Christ strengthen your conviction as well, because sometimes the greatest act of love occurs at the final moment.